Okay. We're pleased to have as our guest speaker for this evening, Will Sorflaten. And Will is coming from Viva, which many of you will know is a vegan campaigning organization. And today's talk is particularly about the dairy industry, its impact on our health, on the planet, and on, of course, the animals. So without further ado, may I hand over to Will?
Great, thank you very much, Brian, and yeah, thank you for having me today, and for everyone who's joining in. I'll just get the presentation going. Sure, Brian will let me know if that's not working. It should be. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Will. I'm a senior campaigner at Viva. I've been working at Viva for the last 2 years and a bit now. And I've been vegan for coming up to 10 years in about 10 days or so, which is obviously very, very exciting, something to celebrate. So yeah, as Brian said, we'll be focusing in particular on the dairy industry today, looking at the environmental impacts, the health impacts on ourselves, and of course the issues within the animal industry as well. Just sort of as a note, I won't go into extremely graphic detail, but I will be covering the ethical issues, which are quite upsetting. So just as a sort of disclaimer on that subject. Firstly, before we delve into those 3 different aspects, I think it's worthwhile having a sort of pause and thinking about milk and dairy as an issue, as a subject for discussion, whether it's with our family, with our friends, because I find in the many conversations that I've had with people over the last 10 years or so, there's this really strong emotional connection that a lot of people have with meat, but at the same time, there's this very strong defensive reaction that some people can have in certain situations over milk as well. It seems to attract a lot more sort of debate and arguments in the worst case scenarios than, say, a conversation about eggs, and even about fish, and sometimes about meat as well. It's this product that is so natural to us as babies from our own human mother's milk. It's the first thing that humans ever consume, and I think that that's the reason why, as we grow into childhood and adulthood, and we're constantly bombarded with this idea that dairy milk is the perfect food for us throughout childhood and throughout adulthood. This sort of tangled emotional connection that we can have, where we kind of, understandably enough, everyone can easily do it, confuse the marketing of cow's milk with sort of memories and an emotional connection to our own mother's milk when we're first born. You have this idea that dairy milk is absolutely essential for your bones. That's one sort of idea that we often hear. And I think more than a lot of the other animal products that we're told we have to eat, we have this idea that dairy is natural, it's normal, and it's necessary for humans to consume. Of course, as I'm sure many of us have experienced, we get that idea with every single animal product. We get this idea that meat is normal, necessary, and natural as well. But this idea with milk as this sort of white, pure goodness that we absolutely need throughout life is quite an interesting one, which is so far, it's changing somewhat in the last few years, but so far has been a very sort of Eurocentric, American-centric idea. Because when I've done activism in the street and I've talked about dairy, the way that people can react sometimes is with seemingly a complete unawareness that in many parts of the world, dairy milk, cow's milk, is simply not the norm whatsoever. Even in meat-eating, egg-eating societies, it's so far in the last, for the last 200 years, and certainly since World War II, we've really, in this country and in others near us, had this absolute marketing sort of extravaganza about dairy milk, which is quite an interesting one. So I think with that in mind, we'll look at the ethical issues, we'll look at the environmental issues, we'll look at the health issues, and just bear that in mind as a useful sort of reminder when having conversations with our families, with our friends about the issues of the dairy industry, because without a doubt, having looked into every single one of the animal industries, from prawns to eggs to lobsters to beef to pigs and so on, the dairy industry, I think, arguably takes the center stage in terms of the horror, the ethical issues, and the health issues, and also the environmental issues as well. It's really a triple whammy industry, even relatively speaking, compared to all the other ones, which have their own horrors as well. So firstly, I think it's important, just with this marketing idea, that we must have milk. It's quite an interesting fact. I certainly find it interesting when we look at the history of humankind. We look at our evolution. We have certainly, there's no doubt, humans have been eating meat for a very, very long time. But when did humans actually start to consume the milk of a completely different 4-footed 700 kilo animal? It was around 6,000 years ago. And for some people that can sound like, oh, 6,000 years ago, that's actually a very long time ago. That's several generations back. So, you know, maybe we have evolved in those last 6,000 years to consume milk and have no problems with it. But actually 6,000 years ago, in the context of human history, human evolution of hundreds of thousands of years, and if we go back to before the modern human, millions of years, 6,000 years is an absolute blip in our timeline for us to sort of burden ourselves with this very, very unnatural product for a human child, or definitely for a human adult. We are the only species, I'm sure many of us know this already, but it's worth sort of bearing in mind, we are the only species to continue to drink milk after weaning, after our infantile development. And we're definitely the only species to drink the milk of a completely different animal to us. It's not even as though it's primate's milk, which, funnily enough, would disgust many more people than the idea of drinking cow's milk or perhaps goat's milk. It's a bovine 700 kilo sort of animal, and we, as pretty small 70 kilo-ish sort of humans, are drinking this animal's milk in vast quantities. And I'll go into more detail in terms of the health side in a moment. But firstly, I think if we look at the ethical side of the dairy industry, so just as a overview of the dairy industry in the UK, we have this idea, I think more so than other types of animal products, that the UK is quintessential British countryside, is a few peaceful black and white cows mooing calmly in a field with a gentle stream sort of rolling by. And these cows are, you know, the happiest cows you could possibly have in the world. We have this really strong idea in this country. We're told over and over and over again that British dairy farming, I think in particular, is at the very, very best sort of practice in the world. So let's look into whether that is the case and whether this idea of best practice actually means much in the context of animal farming. We may find it's quite a low bar in terms of the best practice. So we have roughly, at any given time, roughly 2 million dairy cows in this country. And the value of the dairy industry in 2018 raked in an astonishing £4.5 billion in the industry, which is in the context of animal products, but also arable products, just generally in the context of agricultural products that the UK creates itself, or it imports or it exports. £4.5 billion is an extremely high amount. It's one of the most profitable, as it were, industries within the food sector in the UK. So it's definitely a really, really big industry that we're talking about with these 2 million dairy cows. But what actually happens within the dairy industry? I know many of you will be familiar with it already, but I think for those of you who are perhaps new to veganism, or just wondering about the dairy industry in particular, what actually happens, I'm just going to go through a sort of recap, a run through of what happens in order to make these black and white Holstein Friesian cows produce milk at such a quantity that humans can, 70 million odd humans in the UK can take all the milk that we so desire, need, in inverted commas, every single year. So the first thing that I find is a lot of people still today are surprised when they learn that cows don't just produce milk. They don't just randomly start producing milk as soon as they pass puberty, for example. They don't just turn grass into milk, which absolutely has to be milked. We have to take the milk out of their udders. I think there's this idea even today that we're almost doing a cow a favor by milking her. There's certainly, I think of a Family Guy sketch, and there's many other examples of a dairy cow being absolutely ecstatic and grateful as a farmer milks her udders. It's a completely obscene sort of removal from the reality of what happens to a dairy cow. But we still, even in 2021, have this idea that somehow humans and cows have a symbiotic relationship where we are helping these cows release their vast quantities of milk. But when we think about it, there's simply no species on the planet which just randomly starts producing milk without any sort of stimulus, any sort of reason. We just don't have dogs who suddenly, without any reason, start producing milk. We don't have humans who, other than in very, very rare cases, we don't have humans who naturally would start lactating for no reason whatsoever. And the obvious answer is that cows have to have given birth to a baby in order for them to produce milk. I think for me, as a vegan of 10 years, that is very much a sort of obvious point. But I definitely can recall when I was 12, 13, 14, saying to a friend, look, I can understand why somebody might be vegetarian, but what on earth is wrong with milk? What on earth is wrong with eggs? These cows just produce milk. What's wrong with that? But I've seen so many times before when I've done activism on the streets or at universities, this sort of dawning realization as the person thinks, oh yeah, you're right, of course they would have to have had a baby to produce milk. I feel so silly. And it can sound a bit silly, but when we remind ourselves that we are constantly bombarded with this idea that milk is natural to humans, it's very understandable that the typical person in the UK might just never have thought about the sort of backstory of milk. We're just never told to think about the backstory of milk or eggs or meat. We're always just given this idea that it's served to us on a plate in a neatly sort of wrapped package, and that's the end of the story. That's all there is to it. But of course, these cows have to have had a baby in order to start producing milk. So for that to happen, farmers have to have artificially inseminated these cows or have brought a bull onto the field for the bull to mate with the cows. In the dairy industry in particular, it's a bit different in the beef industry, but in the dairy industry, artificial insemination, artificial impregnation of the dairy cow is by far the standard way for these cows to become pregnant. And this is a very, very unpleasant, to put it mildly, experience for the dairy cow, who is forced into this very confined space. The farmer puts one hand through her anus to contort the organs to allow for a pipe which has a bull's semen in it to go through her vagina and impregnate the cow. And I mean, I think any of us can imagine that this is not in any way whatsoever a pleasant experience for the dairy cow. It's very upsetting, it's very traumatic. And they go through this process until they are pregnant. And so when the dairy cow has been impregnated in this very, very artificial, unnatural way, she will then, the baby will develop inside her for about 9 months, same as humans. And when the cow is ready to give birth, go into labor, she'll give birth. If all goes well, then the baby will be born, the calf will be there. And I'm sure many of us have seen very, very upsetting videos. Viva ourselves have recorded such videos of the mother will have perhaps 1 hour, perhaps 2 hours, maybe a few hours, on rare occasions a day or two, with the calf, looking after the calf, licking the calf clean, nurturing her baby with her very, very strong maternal instinct that she has, like so many other mammals in general are really sort of have an inherent maternal instinct in them, which makes absolute sense. It's different for some species who breed, they produce the babies and then they go off and do their own thing. But for mammals, whose very sort of defining characteristic is to give milk, to produce milk for their baby, of course we have this strong instinct in us to protect our baby and look after them. That's how evolution works. That's how we all, you know, babies are protected by their parents and can grow up and have new babies and so on. But this maternal instinct is absolutely denied and dismissed in the dairy farming industry, because if the calf is staying with the mother and naturally, as the calf would, is drinking the mother's milk, that means much less milk is available for the humans to consume, for the farmers to sell to humans, even though it's a product that we have absolutely no need of. So the farmer will come. It's a very heartbreaking thing to watch. It's absolutely horrible, but the farmer will come, maybe in a tractor, take the calf away, leave the field. The mother almost always runs after the farmer, calling loudly for her baby to come back. And I don't know, for those of you who have heard it, maybe for those of you who live in the countryside or have just seen it in the countryside, the sound is really like no other, as you hear this mother bellowing for her baby, absolutely helpless, unable to defend her young from this strange species who has for no reason whatsoever taken her baby away from her. And the mother will go through this experience multiple times in her life, because the farmer has to keep her in a constant state of impregnation so that she's always lactating, she's always producing milk for the farmer to take and to sell to the humans. Because at the end of the day, the dairy industry, just like any other animal industry, it's all about the bottom line. It's all about the profit that you can generate per animal that you farm, that you rear. And so after 3 to 4 times of this artificial insemination, this very exhausting, fatiguing pregnancy, and this separation of her calf, her baby, as the cow gets older and older, the milk yield from a typical cow starts to go down at about 5 to 6 years old. And again, it's simply about the bottom line. It's simply about how much profit you can make out of each individual animal. And so when the farmer realizes that this cow has started to produce, even if it's just a few liters less per day or per week, that is the end of the line for the cow. In the farmer's view, the cow has served her purpose. She's now more of a burden than a help, as it were, and so she'll be sent to the slaughterhouse at about 5 to 6 years old, usually. In some cases, the dairy cow will be sent to slaughter sooner if the milk yield is not working out so well, or if the cow is constantly suffering from lameness or mastitis or other sort of diseases. In some cases, the dairy cow will last a bit longer, maybe a year or 2 longer. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the dairy cow is going to be sent to slaughter. And that's something that a lot of people, I think, find it difficult to sort of recognize, that the dairy industry and the egg industry, it's the same process in the egg industry in many ways. At the end of the day, all these animals are being sent to the slaughterhouse in the end. So many people are choosing to be vegetarian, have chosen to be vegetarian for the last few decades, centuries, with the belief that it is wrong to kill animals just for their meat. But it's all about the marketing and the way that the dairy industry and the egg industry are directed at us consumers. We fail to realize, it's very, very much hidden from us, that the dairy cows and the egg layers are also ultimately being sent to the slaughterhouse. They may live for a little bit longer, but I mean, when you look at the process, the life that a dairy cow has, that's arguably much worse a fate than a beef cow who dies sooner than that. But ultimately, they're sent to the slaughterhouse in the end. And so you may be wondering what happens to the calf who's separated from the mother. Well, they're typically put into isolated plastic hutches for 8 weeks. You can see here one of the investigations that Viva has done, a calf of a few weeks old. All you see there, it may look like the photo's been a bit cropped, but you can see in just that one photo the calf's live-in conditions. It's this tiny plastic hutch with fresh hay if they're lucky. Some are not so lucky. For 8 weeks, no mother to nurture them, no other calves to look after them. And in the wild, with natural cattle herds, the baby will be introduced back to the herd. The baby will meet all of the other animals in the herd, usually about 20 animals to a cattle herd, roughly. And they will have so much social development, socializing, care and attention. They're very much herd animals. Cows, but this is a complete deviation from the natural pattern of things for this calf. And Viva has found, if it weren't bad enough for calves to be left in this condition for 8 weeks, Viva has done investigations where we found farms that have exceeded 8 weeks long. We've even known of farms which have kept calves in these tiny little plastic hutches for 6 months, which is, I mean, for those of you who have experienced maybe some self-isolation in the last year and a half, you could get cranky after a few days in a house, but 6 months in that tiny little cage, simply because they're born into the dairy industry, there's just no sort of justification for that. This is a practice which has received a lot of attention in the last few years, that males are typically slaughtered a day or two after being born, with the sole reason that dairy calves don't produce dairy. Male calves don't produce dairy because they're males, and so they're seen as a waste product. That has received a lot of understandably negative press as the practice has become sort of more picked up by the media, more picked up by people in general, and dairy farmers are committing slowly to ending this practice, and some supermarkets are saying that they won't accept dairy from farms which perform this practice from 2022. Instead, these male dairy calves will be introduced into beef herds and killed at about a year and a half old. So, I mean, it doesn't attract as much media attention. It doesn't attract sort of the negativity of killing a calf at 1 to 2 days old, but it's not as though these male dairy calves are being sent to sanctuaries or anything like that. They're just going to be slaughtered a year and a half later instead. And so I think this is the last sort of bit I'll focus on in terms of the ethical side of things. I'll then move on to the health and the environmental issues. But within the last 50 years, the typical milk yield of a dairy cow in the UK has gone from 10 litres produced per day to 22 litres per day. So more than double their milk yield in the last 50 years, which again may sound like quite a few years, but actually when we think how few generations that would be and what an enormous increase that is, to go from, I mean, 10 litres per day in 1970s was already asking a huge amount of these dairy cows, not asking it, enforcing this huge exhausted amount on dairy cows. 22 litres per day is just something that I don't think any of us can really comprehend what a burden that is for these dairy cows, because they're, through artificial selection and other techniques, they are being forced to produce more and more milk every single day. You can see here from one of our investigations how huge that udder is. And just for, I think a lot of people, myself included a while back, kind of just thought dairy cows had these massive udders because they are just milk producers. They just naturally produce this milk for everyone. But when you, if you're next sort of going past a farm or in the countryside and you see beef cattle, you'll see that while there are several issues with beef cattle, absolutely, you'll see that their udders are actually of a very much natural size because they're not being put under this huge strain to produce these huge quantities of milk. So next time you see a beef cattle's udder, you'll see what a huge, several times smaller than this poor dairy cow that we see here on the right. And at the same time, these dairy cows are going under a dual sort of process of lactation and impregnation, because 7 months of every 9 months of pregnancy for a dairy cow, she's also pregnant with the next offspring, because the farmers need it to be a consistent cycle of impregnation and lactation. They want the dairy cows to be lactated all the time, which, as we can imagine, is not natural for humans to be having multiple pregnancies straight after one another. It's not natural for most animals, for most mammals, to go through that several years in a row with no sort of break. And this, unsurprisingly, is the reason why 1/3 of dairy cows at any given time in the UK suffer from this horrible problem called mastitis, which is where the udders are so badly used, they're under such constant stress that they start to get extremely sore, extremely hard, extremely tender. It can happen to women as well, and it's an absolutely terrible, painful experience. And these cows do not get any sort of break. They're still milked. They still have these machines put onto them all through the mastitis. And at the same time, almost 1 in 5 dairy cows are lame at any given time in the UK, which is so bad that even the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, has said that this is unacceptable. It still happens, but the fact that even the industry, which is built up to support animal agriculture, says that this statistic is unacceptable, really says quite a lot. So I think that's quite a lot of information perhaps for some of you, but in terms of when we're doing activism, in terms of when we're talking to people on the street or whoever it may be, and they say, well, what's actually wrong with dairy? The things that I tend to focus on are the calf separation, the fact that the dairy cows are killed as soon as their milk yield starts to drop, which is at about 5 to 6 years old, even though cows naturally could live for 20 to 25 years of age. So they're killed at roughly 1/4, 1/5 of their natural life expectancy, which, if you equate it to human terms, would be killing us when we're about 15 years old, just because our milk production would start to decline. And the fact that they're under this constant, absolutely merciless cycle of dual lactation and impregnation over and over and over again. There's so many issues to unpack with the dairy industry, but those are 3 of the key takeaway points that I tend to bring up when I'm talking to people about the dairy industry. So that may be useful for any of you who do activism as well. Okay, so that was quite a sort of emotional barrage on the dairy industry. Again, many of you may have known that, but I think it's useful for all of us to sort of have a recap of just what is it about the dairy industry that is so unjustifiable and so unacceptable. At the end, there'll be questions, so I'd be very happy to answer questions like, oh, but are there any sort of ethical dairy industries like ahimsa milk? Is that okay? I'd be very happy to answer any questions on that subject. But for now, I will look into the environmental issues surrounding the dairy industry. So I think one of the key facts that I still find hard to comprehend is that if cows, and this does include beef, but if cows, farmed cattle, were to form a nation, they were to form a country, and we were to look at, okay, what are their environmental statistics? They would be the 3rd biggest polluter in the world, behind China and the USA. So cows, farmed cows globally, cause far, far more pollution than the UK in its entirety, than India with more than a billion people, than France, than Germany. It's a really, really huge environmental issue with us, and this insatiable desire that we have for farming cows for beef and dairy, when they are such, no fault of their own, but they are such an environmentally disastrous sort of industry, as it were. And of course, you know, we're going through a climate crisis. Some of you may have seen in the news today or yesterday that Canada has, in the last few days, twice broken its record for the hottest condition, the hottest temperature it's ever had in human history, at almost 50 degrees Celsius in Canada in June, which is just I mean, that's just one example, and some people may say, oh well, what's so bad about that? But I mean, we're looking at ice caps melting, we're looking at severe sea level rises. I mean, we in the UK, I'm based in Bristol. I've not had anything absolutely disastrous, but even here we can see in the last 2-3 months that the seasons are really being altered in a really concerning way for crop production, for all sorts of things. The climate crisis is not just something which affects polar bears on the northern pole, and even if that would be bad enough as it is, but when we're looking at this climate crisis, which genuinely poses severe threats to all of us around the world, and we've still got this fixation on having dairy every day, almost every day, and having beef every day, it's a really, we've got this issue that we could fix so easily. But well, I'm assuming most of us have made the change, but as a nation and as a global population, we're still dragging our feet on this huge issue within animal agriculture. So why is it that cows, if they were a nation, would be the third biggest polluter in the world? There are a few different reasons for that. One of the key reasons is that cows are ruminant animals. They have 4 stomachs, which many people know, but by having these 4 stomachs and having a diet which is almost entirely grass, the way that the cow consumes the grass, I won't go into the technical details, but essentially the way that the cow consumes the grass means that, with their 4 stomachs, means that they produce a huge quantity of methane gas. When we think of the climate crisis, we often think of, oh, well, carbon dioxide going into the air as a greenhouse gas, warming the ozone layer, causing problems within our atmosphere. And that is very much true, but we often forget that methane is actually a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I think many of us may draw back on those days long ago of GCSEs or O-levels and hearing about carbon dioxide, but methane is absolutely a key villain in this issue of the climate crisis. It's 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of how quickly, how rapidly it heats our planet up, our atmosphere. One thing that the National Farmers Union, that the dairy industry often says in response to this fact is, oh well, methane is only around around the atmosphere for 10 years. A cow will produce some methane, but in 10 years' time, that methane will dissipate. So it's not actually something that we need to worry about. Methane is not a problem. It's an extremely misleading issue, an extremely misleading statement that the dairy industry makes, which is this idea that, oh, well, the cow population in the UK is remaining relatively stable. So actually, we don't need to worry about this methane because it's just disappearing every year. So it's not actually an increase of methane. But when we think about it, it's not natural for the UK to have 2 million dairy cows, let alone the beef cows as well, in this country. And it's not natural for them to be producing this methane year after year after year. It doesn't really matter if 50 years down the line, we still have 2 million dairy cows. We can massively reduce that amount by no longer buying dairy, by no longer buying cow products. And yes, the methane disappears, but wouldn't it be much better for 1 million cows' methane to disappear entirely from the world rather than repeatedly being put back out there into the atmosphere? Because one cow, yeah, their methane will disappear 10 years later, but in the dairy industry, that cow has long ago been replaced by another cow who produces more methane and another cow who produces more methane. So it's an extremely misleading thing from farmers that I've heard time and time again, that somehow methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas and yet somehow is not a problem. It absolutely is a problem in the climate crisis. So there was this really useful thing that the BBC published 3 years ago now, which was part of the Oxford University study in 2018, which found that going vegan was the single biggest thing that we can do for the environment. And so I really find this chart really interesting, because you can see so clearly, so succinctly, that the dairy industry absolutely maxes out on emissions, on land use and water use. Give you a moment to look through that. I'm just going to open the window because I'm a bit hot. I'll just grab a glass of water as well. Getting worked up on this issue. And you can see, I mean, the graph speaks for itself when you look at the huge reduction in water use, land use, emissions from the other products on there. Almond milk does have its problems, especially if it's almonds which are sourced from certain parts of California, which naturally is a desert. It's not a natural place for huge plantations of almond trees to be. But even with that issue, you can see that's got so much media attention, and yet it's less than half the water use of dairy milk in the UK. So even with the plant milks, which are less than ideal, they're still having a much less of an impact than the dairy industry. So we've got a few minutes before we open up for questions. So I'll just wrap up with the health side of things. So I remember when I was a child growing up, I used to have something like, I feel a bit nauseous thinking of it now, but I used to have every time after dinner, I would have about this much milk every single day after dinner. And I would tell myself, and I think my parents told me as well, that this was really good for my bones, this was really good for me growing taller and stronger and all that sort of thing. And I would drink that milk with satisfaction, thinking I'm getting what I need, I'm getting all the calcium that I need, and so on. But certainly thinking of it from a British or a Eurocentric point of view, we forget that the vast majority of the human population is lactose intolerant. It differs depending on ethnicity, but for example, Eastern Asians are roughly 95% lactose intolerant. African Americans, roughly 70%. In the UK, we are one of the least lactose intolerant of all ethnicities. White British are one of the least lactose intolerant, about 5 to 15%, and in other parts of Europe as well, it's roughly 15% are lactose intolerant. But while that's really just because the dairy industry kicked off around this sort of part of the world, and even then, with this sort of fixation that we've had on it for so many generations, the fact that still quite a few of us are, 15% of the UK, as millions of people are lactose intolerant. Why is it that we're told as a species that we need to be drinking this product if so many of us, especially when you look at the world's population as a whole, so many of us can't stomach it, literally can't stomach it? As I mentioned at the start, we're the only mammal to do this. We're the only mammal to drink another species' milk, not even a species which is remotely similar to humankind. And at the same time, even if it were natural for us to do it, it's not particularly natural for 2/3 of milk to come from pregnant cows. As I mentioned, they're in that dual process of being impregnated and lactating at the same time. And what this means with these pregnant cows whose hormones are going all over the place as they're lactating from their previous impregnation is that dairy milk has 35 different types of hormones. And crucially, dairy milk includes IGF-1, which some of you may have heard of or come across, insulin-like growth factor 1, which has been directly linked to promoting certain types of cancer in the human body. So IGF-1 is in human mother's breast milk. It's a perfectly natural product to have. And as the name suggests, the reason it exists is to promote growth in your baby. So if a human were to have a baby and breast milk them, IGF-1 is doing wonders for the baby because it's promoting growth. They're a tiny little baby. They need to grow into adults one day. They need to develop, their cells need to grow, and so on. Their skeletons need to grow. IGF-1 is perfect for that because it's kind of a catalyst for helping the baby to grow. In exactly the same way, Calves are suckling IGF-1 as part of their mother's milk, and they're growing as well. Now, the difference between a baby human and a baby calf is that one of us has about 50 kilograms of weight to grow. The average woman in the UK, about 60 kilograms, average man, 70 odd kilograms. They've got about 50 to 70 kilograms of growth ahead of them over the next 20 years or so. Difference with a calf is that they've got hundreds of kilograms of growth to do within 2 years. So there's it's one thing, it's perfectly natural for the calf to be drinking the cow's milk, not so much for a fully developed 25-year-old man or woman to be drinking IGF-1, a product which has IGF-1 in it as well. So when we look at all of those sorts of issues, I think the answer I'd say when people say, but don't we need dairy, as well, several nations across the world simply don't drink dairy milk whatsoever, and they're perfectly healthy, perfectly fine. There are, there's no evidence, there never has been any evidence in the slightest that we need dairy. And actually, going one step further, it's extremely bad for us. It can cause bloating, cramp. It can be linked to certain types of acne, more seriously, certain types of cancer. This IGF-1 that I just mentioned, it's a sort of cocktail of issues for the human body. Whether you're a child who's still developing or a human or an adult who's fully developed, IGF-1 is not good for us other than from our mother's milk as babies, and the science absolutely corroborates that. So lastly, before we take it to some Q&A, one question that we may all have is, well, with all of this in mind, in 2021, as veganism continues to grow and grow and grow in the UK and around the world, is the dairy industry on its way out? Is it actually, some of us may have heard stories of prominent dairy industries going bust in the last few years, whether that's in the UK or the USA or elsewhere. But is it actually, are we looking at 5 years' time, is the British population going to shrug off this dependence that we have on this product? So one really reassuring sort of positive fact that I think many of us would agree on is that compared to 1974, milk consumption has declined by 50%. So back in 1974, the average human was having, the average person in Britain was having 2.8 litres of milk per week. Certainly as a child, I was having much more than that. But now, today, the average person in the UK is having 1.4 litres of milk per week, which is still, when you think of what I just mentioned about the IGF-1 and all those things, is a very concerning number. But that's a huge reduction. That's a huge reduction in less than 50 years' time. If you were to look at that, that's about 1% drop every single year, a little bit more than that. And on the contrary, unsurprisingly, with that, when you think about that dip, plant milks continue to grow in double digits, often per year, and they now account for 5% of the total milk/milk alternatives market in the UK. Obviously, that's going to continue to grow. That is a pretty small amount. When I was preparing for this presentation, I was actually thinking it would have increased since I last checked it out, but 5% right now. It's certainly not a done deal, though. Cheese sales are actually growing, disappointingly, as the years go by. Liquid milk is going down, but cheese is growing. I'm not 100% sure on yogurt, but there's certainly not this sort of, much as we might like to see it, there's certainly not this huge sort of drop. That means dairy is going to be gone in 3 years or so, to be the bearer of bad news. So times are absolutely changing. We can see that in so many different ways, but there still is a lot of work to be done. So what has Viva done in the last few years? For anyone who's not aware, Viva has been going strong since 1994, and we cover all sort of issues within animal agriculture, not just dairy. We have a scarydairy.org.uk website, which you can check out. Every May we do Moo Free May. The dairy industry has, I'm just going to get the sun out of my face, Haven't seen that in a while. The dairy industry has sort of tried to fight back against veganuary with February Dairy, bad name I know, but animal organizations such as Viva have kind of dismantled that on social media. We had our trash campaign, I think that was in 2018, with, as you can see, I think that was on the M6, a massive billboard highlighting what actually happens to male calves. We do university tours, which will be restarting again in this September with a focus on cheese. A Viva Licious tour, which was an ice cream tour around the country, a coffee tour as well, showing that we can have nice lattes, we can have nice milk that doesn't curdle, which doesn't have to come from a cow. And we've done investigations into Arla, into Cadbury's, the big players in the dairy industry before, and revealed, you know, as that headline says, shocking conditions for them, horrific conditions. And we will continue, of course, to do so as long as there are animals suffering these, you know, horrendous injustices here. So if you'd like to get involved with us, if you want to write that link down, or you can just on a search engine, Viva vegan charity, get involved, something along those lines. I'll just leave that there for a moment if anyone wants to jot that down. What will you find on there? You can send us an email to say, oh, I'm based in Bath and I would love to be notified whenever you do an event in Bath or the area around there, or in Glasgow or Cardiff or wherever you may be. You can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. If you search Viva or Viva Vegan Charity, should come up on there. And we regularly update everyone on what we're doing, what we're up to on there as well. And on that link as well, you can subscribe to our newsletter for up-to-date monthly information on what we're up to as well. So thank you very much for joining me. I think Brian will be able to open it up to the floor. I think he'll be able to unmute your, if you have any questions. I'll just stop the screen share now so that we can see each other again. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have on the dairy industry in particular, but I'm also very happy to answer any questions on veganism in general or Viva's work. So thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Will. That was very, very informative. I think even for those of us who've been vegan for many years, there was a lot of information there. A couple of questions. By the way, I did post a message out. If you do have questions, put them in the chat box, or in a moment, I know maybe one or two of you can't do the chat box, just stick your hand up and or something, and I'll come to you. But a couple of questions that we've got so far. One was specifically about the statistics. This was Martin asking, where did you get the stats for the lameness and the mastitis? Where did they come from? Do you recall?
Yes, so I think a few months ago, about a year ago, Viva completely rehauled our website. We completely updated it, made the most of lockdown work from home to spend time on that. So I researched the dairy industry in detail. So I'll just post that link in the chat, and that has fully referenced sources for absolutely everything that I mentioned there. I think in terms of the lameness in particular, I'm pretty sure that was from the Agricultural and Horticultural Development Board, which is similar to DEFRA, similar to the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, i.e. the farming industry. The AHDB regularly does reports on the situation within all animal agriculture industries. They are very much built to support the industry, but they do write up on things like the rates of lameness, like the rates of mastitis as well. And that was where the DEFRA said that the 17% lameness was unacceptable. So if you follow that link, and if you just go down to the section how dairy cows are farmed, and you'll see the lameness stat there. It'll have a footnote, and you can find the reference on there.
Great. Thank you very much. Then there's a question from Jay, if I can find where it's gone. Said one person argued that if they became vegan, it could have an adverse effect on the number of cows and that it could lead to their extinction. And what happens, what would you do with the cows in farms? Can they survive in the wild? I guess there's this general question of, if we all go vegan overnight, what happens to the cows?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I've heard it, many times. So I think, firstly, one of the important things to bear in mind is that in no sort of realistic scenario whatsoever is the world tomorrow or any day going to suddenly turn vegan. We're not going to have a situation, even sort of if we try and be more conservative, we're not even going to have a situation where tomorrow 10 million Brits go vegan and suddenly there's this really big change in supply and demand. It's going to be a gradual shift, and as we've seen, even though it's been quite explosive in the last few years, we're still at only about 3% of the population at most is vegan, and that has been a steady sort of rise like that. So while that's been happening, we've had a similarly steady, predictable decline in the demand for animal products such as milk or eggs or what have you. So it's worth bearing in mind, we're never going to be in that situation of what happens if tomorrow we all wake up and suddenly nobody wants to eat these animals. What do we do with them? It's much more of a steady decline that we're going to be seeing in the demand. And just like any other industry, the animal industry is in turn are a commercial industry which see their animals as products. And just like any industry, if the demand for something starts to go down, it's not as though these cows and pigs and whatever are just breeding like rabbits and just producing numerous cows that the farmers just have to deal with. They're being artificially impregnated by the farmer. They're being artificially manipulated to have babies. So if the dairy industry recognises that the demand for milk goes down by about 1% per year, it's not in their interest to continue as they're doing and continue to impregnate the same number of cows to have the same number of calves, because cows cost money to rear, to farm. And if they're not going to, if they know that several thousand litres are going to be wasted every year because they're keeping the same number of cows, they're simply not going to do that like any business wouldn't do. So we're much more going to be seeing the situation of, rather than having dairy cows wandering the streets, or where on earth are we going to keep them and look after them, it's going to be a lot less dramatic than that. It's going to be a decline where we have fewer and fewer animals who are being farmed. We may get to a situation where we do have an excess number of farmed animals who no longer are, their products are no longer in demand by the human population, in which case it would be a much smaller scale sort of thing where we would be able to provide sanctuaries for them and just let them live out the rest of their lives. The thing is, some people say, oh, well, so you want the dairy cow to go extinct. And when we actually look at what we've done to the modern dairy cow in the UK, there is no kindness in letting that subspecies of cow continue to live. They have been so artificially manipulated over the last few years, the last decades, that even if you kept a calf with her cow nowadays, the cow is producing 22 litres per day. That's much, much more than a calf would drink. They are in pain. They have these coat rack appearances because their bodies are producing so much milk that they literally go into metabolic hunger, which is where they simply cannot consume enough calories to function properly. It is not a subspecies which we want to see continuing to exist whatsoever. So if they can be phased out of existence by farmers no longer breeding them, that would be the kindest thing for these animals. That doesn't mean the end of cows as a whole. It's hard to think of it, because we're so used to seeing them in fields farmed by humans. But there are semi-wild and wild species of cows who absolutely should be allowed to continue to live, because they've not been so artificially manipulated by humans that their life is literally just a life of pain and suffering. Those animals, they're not farmed, they can continue to be around. And it's the same with all the different animals that we farm. If we stopped eating pigs and stopped farming pigs, that wouldn't be the end of pigs, because there are wild pigs, there are wild boar, that we have, such as in the southwest of the Forest of Dean, I think it is. You know, there are wild boar in the world. There are wild chickens in the world. There are wild, all sorts of different wild goats in the world, wild sheep in the world. Those species would continue to survive. We're not asking to wipe out cows as a whole. We're just asking to end the use of these really poorly treated, absolutely artificially selected, manipulated cows.
Thank you for that. There's a few other questions. I know we're a bit short of time. Are you aware of any vegan baby formula?
Yeah, in the USA, interestingly, even though they've got such a fixation on milk, about 40% of mothers, if they're using breast milk substitute, use a soya-based substitute instead, which I find quite an interesting fact, because I think nowhere in the world has dairy had such a sort of marketing grip as in the USA, and perhaps in the UK as well. I'm not aware of any particular brands. As a 25-year-old male, I've never looked into it personally, but I'm sure there would be. And if you'd like to send that question, I'll just, if you'd like to send that question to the email I've just put in the chat, I'm sure there are some mothers or recent mothers at Viva, so I'm sure that they would be able to answer that in better detail. But I would imagine a search engine would come up with some results. So they definitely do exist.
Just say we got in 3 months' time, that was July or September meeting. We've got Sandra Hood, who's a vegan dietitian specialising in plant-based food in pregnancy and young children. So tune in for that meeting. Hopefully the answer will be there. Next question is cheese. Any arguments that you found helpful in making people think differently about their relationship with it, particularly? And that they said about the attraction of cheese. I know cheese is addictive, so that's probably why people have a struggle getting off it. But in terms of arguments that you'd be using, Will, to help people come off dairy cheese?
Yeah, so I think cheese is one of those ones where the fact of the matter is there's no sort of getting around. We've got very good alternatives for many things, and from a vegan's perspective of 10 years, I do like Violife in particular and other vegan cheeses. But the issue that people have who, if they're on a dairy heavy diet and they try vegan cheese, they often find it very disgusting or unpalatable. And the reason for that, as Brian mentioned, is that dairy cheese literally is addictive. Dairy milk to a lesser degree is addictive as well. But when we think of mother's milk for any mammal, it absolutely makes sense for it to be addictive. Human babies don't like to be weaned. I don't remember it personally, but I'm sure I didn't like to be weaned, and I'm sure none of us like to be weaned, because it's literally an addictive substance that we, evolutionary wise, want to be having. We want to keep on having it. It absolutely makes sense for a baby to want to be growing stronger, want to be staying near to their mother, or from an evolutionary survival point of view. And the reason why cheese is so much more addictive is because it's concentrated dairy milk. It's melted down to be a solid product. So it's literally much more concentrated than a glass of milk would be per gram. So I find that's quite a useful thing to bring up with people. They seem to find it useful to know that it's literally an addictive substance, because I've had so many people say, I really want to be vegan, but I just cannot shake off this cheese. And for them to know that it's an understandable reaction, it's literally addictive, that seems to work quite well. And then I just bring up the same things as I mentioned on the health side, the environmental side, the ethical side, whether that's talking about milk or cheese in particular, or yogurt.
Thank you for that. Sadly, we've run out of time. I just say thanks to those who've asked questions. For those who haven't yet, did you want to say a very quick thing, John? If you so, unmute yourself.
Yeah, a quick one.
Because we're running out.
Do you know much about the rise of the huge mega farms where the dairy cattle and feedlots, which is started in America and has been beginning to spread to England, they produce much cheaper milk. Do you know much about their increase in Britain?
Yeah, that's a good question, John, and that is something which has very much taken hold in the UK, sadly. So now in 2021, 1/5 of dairy cows in the UK are on these zero grazing feedlots. It's called zero grazing farming, where it's literally the dairy cow does not graze. They don't see a blade of grass in their entire life. And that's 1/5, 20% of dairy cows nowadays are in these feedlots. So, I mean, there's so many issues within the dairy industry, but for them to not even be in, to spend their life on concrete without any sort of natural environment whatsoever is, deeply concerning. And it's set to rise because, as you said, John, it's a much cheaper way of producing milk, and that, at the end of the day, is just the way that the animal industry works. There's more information on the zero grazing on the link in the I put in the chat box if you'd like to find out more.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just say I'm just going to wind this up now. So can I just say a very big thank you to Will. If you'd like to unmute and give him a round of applause, I will do.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you from America.
We'll say.
Will, can I ask you something? Sorry, it's Hazel. I don't want to be on camera because of Facebook, but I was just asking Brian to ask you if you have a concise video on Viva. I know a lot of people who want to be vegan, but they don't believe the dairy industry, the horrors. Do you have a video on your website, quite a concise one that would have an impact?
Just on dairy in particular?
Well, mainly, yes, because they won't come off the cheese and the egg and all that,
Yeah, I'll leave my email if anyone wants to get in touch. So info@Viva will go to the info box at Viva, and they can pass it on to me. But if you also want to, if Hazel, you just email me, then I should be able to send that over to you tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's Will at Viva. And just to say the video Hogwarts, not Hogwarts, what's it called? Hogwood Farm is, I assume it's still free to watch on, was it Amazon Prime?
Yes, yeah, it's Amazon free Prime. To watch on Amazon Prime, yeah.
So just a little plug for that one. If you haven't seen it, it shows the horrors of, again, factory farming. Thanks, Will. I'll let you go. For those rest of us, just say we're going to be staying online for another 25 minutes or so, have a bit of a discussion and a few announcements. But just say thanks, Will. I'll let you go on your way. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Brian, for all your work for the animals.
Okay. So the rest of everybody, please do stay on.
Please do stay